CAPRI exists to provide evidence-informed research that answers policymakers' most pressing questions about Jamaica and the Caribbean. In doing so, we often find ourselves bridging knowledge gaps that hinder the development of data-driven policies backed by a proof of concept from elsewhere. One such question is, what roles do women play in organized violence in Jamaica? The Caribbean Policy Research Institute, CAPRI, has taken up this challenge, exploring the intersections of gender, crime, and the governance of Jamaica's violent communities to uncover the forces driving women's participation in Jamaica's greatest threat to stability and security. Good evening. I'm Stanley McIntosh, a researcher at CAPRI, an independent think tank dedicated to evidence-based research in the areas of the economy, the environment, governance, and social issues to improve public policy in Jamaica and the Caribbean. Tonight, we launch our first report of 2025, Hits and Misses, Women in Organized Violence. This study is part of CAPRI's ongoing research into Jamaica's most pressing development issue, the gang violence that makes Jamaica have one of the highest murder rates in the world. This is also the fourth of 9 studies that CAPRI is undertaking with the support of our steadfast partner, the European Union, under the project Civil Society Organizations as Actors of Governance and Development. We're deeply grateful for the EU's ongoing support, which allows us to continue our mission of informing public policy through rigorous, evidence-driven research. This study challenges prevailing assumptions about female criminality, examining the data in an attempt to dissect the structural, economic, and social factors shaping women's role in gangs and organized crime. Tonight's event features a presentation of the report by Diana Thorburn, CAPRI's Director of Research, followed by a panel discussion with Mrs. Claudette Thompson, Senior Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions, Office of the DPP, Dr. Delia Bean, Head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the UWI campus, and Mr. Dennis Brooks, Senior Superintendent of Police and Chief Communication Strategist at the Jamaica Constabulary Force. Dr. Thorburn will both moderate and participate in the discussion, and then we'll invite both our in-person and online audience to engage by submitting questions via Slido. Slido instructions will be shared shortly. We also encourage you to join the conversation online. Share your insights, your thoughts, and key takeaways using the hashtag Hits and Misses and CAPRI Forum on both Instagram and Twitter. Before we begin, we will hear remarks from Mr. Aniceto Rodriguez Ruiz, who is the Head of Corporations for the Delegation of the European Union to Jamaica, Belize, and Bahamas. Following that, Diana will present the report, and then we'll move into our panel discussion. Once again, thank you all for being here, and I encourage you to open your mind, listen closely, and engage thoughtfully, then pose your questions to the panel discussion. For it is through dialogical engagement and critical inquiry that we, both you and CAPRI, can together deepen our understanding and contribute to meaningful solutions for Jamaica's future. I now turn over to Mr. Aniceto Rodriguez Ruiz from the European Union delegation.
Thank you very much. Good evening, dear friends of CAPRI, also from the whole academia, community, and the UWI. Also representatives from the Jamaica Constabulary Force and also the Prosecutor's Office and public in general. Dear friends, good evening, everybody. In 2014, the European Union agreed a strategy on public security that this strategy acknowledged that crime and violence were the main obstacles against the full development of countries in Latin America and in the Caribbean. This strategy also stressed the need for a regional consensus on public safety having a human development approach. The strategy notes that in situations of insecurity, citizens tend to lose confidence in the state's ability to provide social services. And this is dangerous because the gap that the state leaves, somebody else will fill it. And often it's organized crime who fills these gaps. This strategy committed the European Union to strengthening the capacity of regional governments to deliver quality public services that will contribute to achieving public security for all, for women, for men, but also for boys and girls. To this end, in 2020, the EU delegation in Jamaica committed to support the Citizen Security Plan of the government of Jamaica through a program still ongoing, coming soon to an end, Citizen Security Budget Support Program with 20 million euros, that is roughly 3.5 billion Jamaican dollars. The term, about the vocabulary calling that citizen security is very wide because it includes the process of establishing, of strengthening, and protecting democratic civic order, eliminating threats of violence in a population and allowing for safe and peaceful coexistence. In essence, it's a holistic approach to securing peace through targeted state actions directed at improving the life of all persons regardless of gender, vulnerabilities, or any other differences. The Citizen Security Program continues to support the government of Jamaica's reform of the approach to crime and violence through coordinated all-of-government interventions informed by evidence-based data and focused on prevention. This European Union support has involved three main aspects. First, providing financial assistance in the form of budget support to enable government agencies to deliver core social services and initiatives within the most vulnerable communities. Second, the program has provided highly specialized technical assistance in the form of experts, research, and training to improve delivery mechanisms, coordination, quality, and effectiveness of interventions to the target populations. Finally, this program also had a component providing funds to support civil society participation in the implementation of initiatives that have a deeper reach to beneficiaries. I take the opportunity also, I mentioned that this program is coming to an end, that there is current discussions between the EU and the government of Jamaica on the targets for the second phase of this program, this time with a very specific component focusing on gender-based violence. It shows that women are primarily the victims of violence, but there is also, in less number of cases, they also have been perpetrators of violence. By funding this CAPRI research, this CAPRI program is not one of these citizen security components of it's in another program, but it's very pertinent because it's very linked and mainly with the topic that we are talking today. In many countries in the world, there has been an emergence and divergence of crimes in society, which has resulted in varied government response. We, at the European Union, respect the fact that each country and its government will decide on the best ways to uphold its commitment to human rights, and to that end, We also acknowledge the role of civil society in being a part of the accountability framework, ensuring the protection of these human rights. I therefore take this opportunity to congratulate CAPRI on the achievement of this report, of all the other reports that they are providing, and encourage all parties to participate in the necessary actions that will ensure more strategic hits and misses in the global aspirations for a safer world, contributing to shaping a future in which Jamaica is the preferred place to live. Thank you very much.
Waiting for my slides to get up there. There we are. Even with one of the highest femicide rates in the world, only 1 in 10 murder victims in Jamaica is female. I say only because that's below the global average of 2 to 3. The reason? Jamaica's violence is so overwhelmingly driven by gangs, young men shooting each other as they conduct the business of organized crime. My name is Diana Thorburn, and I'm CAPRI's Director of Research. I led the team of researchers who has been working on this report that we're launching tonight since we started it in 2019. If Jamaica's violence is so male-dominated, then why are we here to talk about women in it? Because there's a popular idea of a rising female gangstress that we wanted to examine. Understanding how women operate and participate in organized crime is key to understanding gangs, which remains the greatest challenge to Jamaica's peace, citizen security, economic development, and our overall well-being as a country and as a people. That statistical paradox, Jamaica's high femicide rate and its proportionally low female victim count, reflects exactly what this study reveals. The numbers alone don't tell the full story. This report examines how and why women are involved in Jamaica's organized violence ecosystem, what functions they serve, and what that means for violence reduction policy and practice in Jamaica. So let's situate this study in context. First, another paradox. Jamaica has one of the highest murder rates in the Latin America Caribbean region, but we have the lowest victimization rate, meaning that the number of people who report that they have been a victim of a crime is lowest in Jamaica than anywhere else in Latin America and the Caribbean. This contradiction is explained by the nature of our violence, which is armed violence, primarily in the form of targeted shootings carried out by gangs. 70% of murders in Jamaica are linked to gangs. 20% are considered interpersonal, but a large portion of those are indirectly linked to gangs. Without gangs, Jamaica's murder rate would be below the global average, which is where we were in the 1960s. The discrepancy between our victimization rate and our murder rate is because violence in Jamaica is so concentrated within small insular groups of young men killing each other within organized crime networks. Those embedded in the network are 158 times more likely to be homicide victims than any of us here in this room, than the general population. So if we want to reduce violent crime, we must dismantle gangs. If we want to dismantle gangs, we must address the structural conditions that allow gangs to operate with impunity. It's within that context that we ask the question, where are the women? Here's what the data tells us about women's roles in violent crime. Women are more commonly involved in nonviolent offenses such as drug trafficking and financial crimes. Women commit far fewer violent crimes than men do. Women rarely directly commit violent crimes. When they do, it's almost always in domestic settings or personal disputes or conflicts, not in gang-related shootings. And the most prevalent form of domestic violence committed by women in Jamaica is violence against children. Women's involvement in serious violent crimes is marginal. Less than 3% of those arrested and charged for Category 1 crimes, these are violent crimes, murder, shooting, assault, larceny, robbery, in 2021 were women. For murder alone, women accounted for just 2% of all arrests. We weren't able to identify a single recorded case of a woman firing a weapon in a gang-related homicide. Even in police killings, there has been only one known instance of a woman fatally shooting someone that happened in 2018. Women made up some 4% of gang-related arrests in 2024. And let's stop for a moment at that number because that tells us a lot about what we're here talking about. 4% could be a lot or a little, but we don't have the data from years before to know whether this is an increase or a decrease, so we just have to take the number on the face of it. Another confounding factor is that international trends do not match Jamaica's reality. Across the world, there is an increase of women involved in violent crime. They are participating at a higher rate, they're being incarcerated at a higher rate than men are for violent crimes in many countries across the world, including in the Latin America region. But in the Caribbean, the opposite is happening. Female incarceration rates are holding steady or are actually declining. And Jamaica has one of the lowest incarceration rates in the entire hemisphere. Only lower than us are Haiti and Guatemala, who we're almost equal with, and one of the lowest women's incarceration rates. So any assumption that Jamaica would be keeping with international trends of rising female criminality is not borne out by the data. So where is this narrative coming from? There are a few possible explanations. One might be a law enforcement perception bias, where a few more women are arrested and charged, and this may be unusual, and so it may feel like a surge, even if they still make up only a tiny proportion of offenders. The media may be playing a role, where cases involving women tend to be highly publicized, reinforcing the idea of a trend that isn't reflected in the data. And then we have the reinforcement loop that comes from law enforcement's perception being influenced by increased media coverage, and so on and so forth. However, it's also possible that women's increasing involvement in violent crime isn't fully captured in the data. Across criminology, the female invisibility phenomenon is well documented. Women's roles in crime are often less visible, underreported, or harder to detect. Further, while the numbers may not show a significant rise in female participation in gang violence, there are structural and contextual factors and shifts that do support the notion. The first of these is Jamaica's generally low incarceration rate. As I mentioned, we have one of the lowest imprisonment rates in the hemisphere. This is in a context where there is an empirical relationship between incarceration rates and murder rates, meaning that there's a negative correlation between the number of homicides and the number of people in prison in Jamaica. So the more people in prison, the lower homicides. The fewer people in prison, the higher the homicide rate. This is an empirically observed phenomenon in Jamaica over the past 2 decades. This means that many criminals, male and female, are simply not in prison. They're not incarcerated. So incarceration data actually is not very helpful to tell us whether women are increasing more in violent crime or not. A second consideration is the dynamics of Jamaica's contemporary labor market. Jamaica is an outlier in many things. We have a record low unemployment rate. We have one of the region's highest labor force participation rates. And we're one of the few countries in the entire world where our labor force participation rates are rising. Within this context here in Jamaica, women's labor force participation rate is rising faster than men's. So in the very low unemployment that we have, more women are taking up jobs and contributing to that. So it follows that if there are more women entering the formal labor force, that it stands to reason that they may also be entering the criminal workforce at higher rates as part of broader labor market trends. The third factor that we can consider is the post-2014 shift in organized crime in Jamaica. The splintering of Jamaica's gangs has meant that the violent crime landscape has moved away from rigid hierarchies and large gangs to smaller, more fluid networks, creating new opportunities for women that might not have been there before. What this means is that it is possible that traditional crime data is missing aspects of women's involvement in organized violent groups, and that the reality is likely more complex than the extremes of either exaggerating or dismissing women's roles in organized crime. Even if official crime statistics do not fully capture women's participation in organized crime, we do have other sources of evidence that help us understand their involvement. These include media reports, statements from police, security personnel, and other stakeholders, academic and policy literature, including from other Caribbean countries where the rising female gang stress phenomenon has been observed, arrest records under the anti-gang legislation, gang trial proceedings, and social media and popular culture. From these sources, it is clear that women have been active in organized crime for some time, even if their roles are less visible than men's. Tanya Stevens had an entire song about it in 2004.
Cause every thug need a gangsta girl for hug.
Hear that?
You don't know, I mean that, got your back, baby.
I'm a front, I'm a side.
Every thug need a gangsta girl for hug.
So women in gangs play key but not directly violent roles. They are not pulling the trigger. If we were to map out a gang's organizational structure, we'd find that there are about 10 distinct roles in it. Women occupy all but 3: Don, Shotter, and Foot Soldier. That is, while women do participate in gangs, they're not typically the ones who are carrying out direct acts of violence. They're not actually doing the shooting. They're not actually doing the killing. Instead, they take on roles where their gender gives them a strategic advantage in positions that are essential to the functioning of the criminal enterprise. But these facilitation roles are not secondary. They're fundamental to how gangs operate. Gangs are business enterprises, primarily about money. Women are integral to financial management, laundering money, collecting extortion payments, running front businesses. A key example of this is Stephanie Muma Christie, who handled the Klansman gang's finances. She arranged bail, paid lawyers, and bribed police officers. She was considered a top-tier member of that gang. Women have a gender advantage when it comes to smuggling contraband because they're less likely to be stopped and searched by male police or security personnel. Because of this, women often transport guns, drugs, and money with less risk of detection. Women play key roles in gathering intelligence as informants, spotters, lures, infiltrators. In the vernacular, these women are called kerosenes or grasmites. They infiltrate rival groups, monitor law enforcement movements, set up targets for attack, among other key functions of a gang. Beyond logistics and intelligence, women also provide essential support services, harboring criminals, providing rest and comfort to gang members. This extends to providing alibis and running interference with law enforcement. So women may not be the ones directly carrying out the violence themselves, but they are deeply embedded in the systems that sustain the violence, that sustain organized crime. And their roles are not just peripheral, they enable the survival and operations of gangs in ways that might be underestimated if we only look at the hard data. So having established that women are active participants in organized crime, even if not as enforcers of violence, we now turn to what drives their involvement in criminal networks. We've distilled the drivers into 3 key factors, though they overlap, making it difficult, as you'll see, to separate where one ends and another begins. Like men in Jamaican gangs, women are drawn to organized crime by financial incentives, not ideology, and from our research, not by coercion. Gangs are often the dominant economic force in the communities where these women live, providing financial security that legitimate jobs do not. So women's roles in lottery scamming, extortion, money laundering are driven by both economic survival and strategic positioning, as access to financial power within criminal networks can offer influence and security. Women typically enter criminal networks through personal relationships rather than active recruitment. In 4 out of the 5 case studies in this report, the women grew up in gang-dominated informal communities. They were family members, neighbors, or romantically involved with dons or other top-tier gang members. Their involvement was shaped by proximity and association. They were embedded in criminal operations from an early age, from a formative age, and gang activity was normalized in the communities where they grew up. And finally, the communities where gangs thrive are characterized by informality and weak governance, with little or no state present. Law enforcement is sporadic and governance structures are ineffective, allowing gangs to operate freely. Irregular land tenure reinforces gang control and increases women's exposure to criminal networks. As long as these conditions persist, as long as there are gangs controlling the communities, women in these communities will remain vulnerable to being enlisted in gangs. This research challenged us to rethink assumptions and grapple with questions that were more complex than they initially seemed. Remember I said we started it in 2019. The findings were not as clear-cut as we expected, making it difficult to distill a straightforward narrative. The statistical data does not support the idea that droves of women are becoming more violent criminals, but that does not mean that they are uninvolved. Other data shows that even if there are not many women in gangs, there are some, and they play critical roles in organized crime. Their involvement is strategic and operational, even though they are not the active or direct perpetrators of violence. So rather than framing this as a rising female gangster problem, we propose that a more useful approach is to understand and address women's roles in the infrastructure of organized violence, acknowledging their presence and ensuring law enforcement strategies account for their roles without exaggeration or omission. So what does all this mean for policy? We propose 3 key recommendations. The first is to reframe gender narratives in crime prevention, to move beyond victim-centric narratives and acknowledge the roles women play in criminal networks, and to ensure crime prevention strategies incorporate gender-sensitive perspectives without reinforcing stereotypes. One specific way to do this is with our second recommendation, which is to expand female participation in law enforcement. Gangs exploit the lowest scrutiny that women receive from law enforcement, and law enforcement should remove that advantage by adjusting appropriately, namely by increasing the deployment of female officers in anti-gang and other security operations. Our third recommendation is structural community transformation in gang-affected areas. This includes regularizing land tenure to remove the safe havens that gangs exploit and diminish gangs' presence and power, and allow for formal governance structures to be properly enabled in these communities, and to ensure that women in informal communities are actively included in regularization processes such as formalization and land titling, thereby reducing their economic dependence and their vulnerability to gang influence. If the ultimate goal is homicide reduction, we cannot cherry-pick the data to support a desired storyline. Evidence, not sentiment, must drive security policy. In this report, we followed the data, even when its conclusions challenged expectations. If we want to reduce violence in Jamaica, we must diminish gang activity and reduce gangs' power. This means targeting the real drivers of gang violence and the structures which contain and facilitate the people, women and men, in the organized violence ecosystem. Not just what seems interesting, not just what feels urgent, but what the evidence demands. That's it. So I'm now going to invite our panelists to join me up here, and while they make their way up, I'm going to tell you about Slido And this is an app on whatever device you're on, and you go to slido.com and type in the event code CAPRI. And there you can pose your questions, but you can also see what other questions have been posed, and you can vote them up. So you can like them, and so that when I see the questions, I will see the questions that people most want answered. So you may go on there and see that somebody has asked a really good question and say, oh, I don't need to ask my question, I'll just vote this question up. So please put your questions in Slido, and this is also for those of you who are joining us online. This allows you to participate in the discussion as well. So slido.com, event code CAPRI, and then I'm going to sit over here. Okay. Okay, so we have with us Ms. Claudette Thompson, the Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions, Mr. Dennis Brooks, Senior Superintendent of Police and Communication Strategist from the JCF, and Dr. Delia Bean, who is the head of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, MONA. So I feel like we have everything represented. We have the gender, we have the police, and we have the justice system all together, which is an ideal panel for us. So I'm going to start the discussion by asking each of you to give a 3-minute take on the report, the findings, particularly coming from your own perspective, IGDS, JCF, the DPP's office. So I'll start with you, Dr. Bean. If you could give us your 3-minute take on the report and the findings. I'm just getting my water.
Thank you so much, and a pleasant good evening to guests here and to my fellow panelists. I think this is a very rich report. So the summary that you would have just given really gave some wonderful highlights. For me personally, I wanted to start at the end of the report because I'm just like that. I think for me, one of the most key takeaway from this is the voices and or experiences of the women that were studied in the case studies. And I think it definitely speaks to the ways in which the official data, the records that we have, though important, as you have said, does not give the full story. And what we need really, in terms of just jumping ahead to where I'm sure you will end in terms of recommendations, is a greater understanding of the nuances of women's lives generally. So women live very multifaceted lives in these communities, in various spaces. And that comes through the case studies. And so I really want to congratulate CAPRI on including this in this report, because very often we don't get to see that depth of insight. So I would start there. I also wanted to make the point that historically, a lot of what you found has been corroborated by the historic narrative. So I'm from gender studies, but I'm also a historian.
Okay.
And it shows the ways in which women's lives have been so neatly interwoven into so many aspects of our society without our being able to capture that in data. So for instance, when the report speaks to recruitment, the fact that women are so critical to recruitment in gangs, this is something that is historically has been done outside of criminal networks. And it shows the ways in which women are such critical, not enforcers, as you've said, but facilitators of various processes. And I think we have to be able to capture that in our research, because otherwise we will miss the wide gamut of experiences that women have had. So those are my starting points right at the end. And I'm happy to speak more about some of these as we go along.
Dennis?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much to our panel. Good evening, everyone. I must say I feel like I've arrived. Being on a CAPRI panel launching a piece of academic research, I have a great deal of respect for what you do.
Thank you.
I am particularly pleased with the title, Women in Organized Violence, because for a very long time, we in the JCF have been at pains to point out that we need to study violence. We need to understand violence as distinct a construct from crime, because in many instances, when we are trying to police violence, it is, I suppose in prosecuting violence, violence does not necessarily behave in the way that crime behaves. But very often we view violence and crime like rice and peas as a one dish, that we do need to extrapolate violence from crime and study it. And one of the ways that we need to study it is from a gendered perspective, because there is so much to unpack in relation to gender, and I like what I saw. Much of the data that I saw come out corroborates what we have been seeing over the last decade in research, and I look forward, I must say, kudos to Dr. Karen Carpenter, who is here, who I've worked with in producing a piece of work that will come out in the future, looking at over the past decade, women in violent crime. But the ways in which we study violence need to understand the behaviors of women. And I think that there has been the data telling a story that maybe common sense narratives often missed, because common sense narratives have notions about what women can do or what women can't do, what women are capable of. And what we are seeing in research like this is that women are capable of much more than people might think. And so let's study it from a very disciplined academic approach, and let's understand more so that we can police it properly, so that we can bring justice, so that we can design policy and regulations and frameworks for that. So that gap in understanding, I think, is significantly, potentially bridged through this research. And we can maybe change some of those long-standing perceptions. So those are my thoughts at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me here. I want to borrow a phrase that Dr. Bean used, insightful. And that's one word that jumps out at me, having looked at the report as someone who has been handling the case files and been involved in the prosecutions. That word is most appropriate in describing the report. Okay. Women have been put in a particular category historically. They've been defined as that person far in the background at home who washes bloody clothes. This is the narrative that you normally get, or provides medication for the injured gangster. This report sees the role of the woman in gang activity, in criminal activity, as she truly is. So she's not just the washerwoman. She not only procures medication, but from what we have seen, where the gangsters are concerned, when we come to talk about criminal organizations, the members literally and actually see them as sometimes the face of the organization. It's interesting in Jamaica, because while they're seen and recognized as the face of the gang, they are not, and you put it there in your presentation, they are not recognized and accepted as leadership material. So the female is not the Don. She's a gangster. She's a gangster girl. But she's not the Don, and she's not the leader, though she's carrying out leadership role and leadership activities. She's a banker as well. She is in charge of logistics. She is responsible for the armory. In many of the case files that we have looked at, it is the female, it is the woman who has the key to the armory. It is the female who plans the missions. It is the female who decides who goes out on the missions, and the role that the men who go out on the missions, the role that they play. And the report properly captures this evolution of the female, of the woman as a gangster. The report also captures the role a female plays as what I term the honeypot, lures the man to become a victim. So I'm going to end where I started. Very insightful.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay,
So we do have some, we have Slido, and we're encouraging those here and online to put in Slido. That's why I'm looking here to see what the Slido questions have come in so far, and also ask you to vote them up. The other thing that I want to talk about before we actually get to the questions, because I think this for us was probably the most confounding. You know, CAPRI has done several reports on gender. We've done several reports on violence. This is us trying to kind of rice and peas the two things in a way, marry the two things. And the real challenge at the outset was this invisibility, this phenomenon of female invisibility in crime and how it's hidden. And I'm interested, Dr. Bean, in this, in your own research as a historian, studying gender, is this phenomenon of the invisibility, yet the critical roles that they play, and how we can kind of better understand that, particularly if we're trying to bring it to policy.
Right, so yes, very, very interesting issue. As you were presenting earlier, we recognize that there are so many contradictions in the crime landscape, as the panel would well know. So there is this issue of invisibility, and I think the key issue has to do with our prevailing gender norms. We cannot escape that. Mm-hmm. We exist in a society that privileges patriarchy, and I say that even over saying privileging masculinity, because patriarchy is equally upheld by men and women, and it equally victimizes men and women. But the point is that there are some rules and regulations that come with patriarchy, which, as has been said, women just aren't seen as leaders in various spaces, even though they are, right? So the way we collect data, for instance, tends to mirror that. We tend to think of the man as the breadwinner, the head of the household, and so on. So because we have this patriarchal framework to even data collection and statistical analysis, we see that this definitely impacts how women show up in research generally. And I think because of the prevailing gender norms that women are nurturing, caring, passive, less violent, less likely to be involved in crime and criminal networks, that alone covers our understanding. So even when we see evidence to the contrary, we're still guided by this deeply held, entrenched belief. So I think that historically has been the reason for this assumed invisibility. And I think it has, as the report says, been used as an advantage. So really debunking this invisibility is not going to be good for criminal networks, so that's a challenge really. But it also gives us an opportunity to move towards empowerment frameworks, right? And to see women as agents rather than being coerced and rather than being invisible. Not to say that there are not some women who are not brought into these against their will, but the fact is the agency of women and the visibility of women comes out so much, and this is really a wonderful aspect of the report.
Okay. How do you deal with this invisibility in the real world of policing, Dennis, with your own data collection and having this idea that this is happening, but we might not be seeing the numbers to it? How is that reconciled at your level?
I mean, we are usually very measured in how we speak of things because we know that there's often emotive language. And we, in terms of the bodies that we see, we don't get to be emotive in that kind of a way. We have to be preparing case files or ensuring that the DPP's office has the evidence to prosecute cases and to bring justice. I think that the invisibility is problematic because of the narratives and the gendered narratives of violence. So it's the ways in which we tell stories. And I am at pains on a weekly, monthly basis in the conversations that I have with journalists who call about things. And I say, but that's not how investigations work. Or they would like to write a headline that says, women continue to be hunted, in that kind of a way. Or they will say it at a time when I'm looking at the numbers that say, actually, it's on a 3-4 year decline. But nobody wants to hear that. And then when you say it, they'll say that you don't care about women. And, and I would say, no, I just don't care about the narrative that you're trying to perpetuate. And so we are mindful of trying to practice law enforcement in an era of, or in an environment of moral panics and media amplification, and telling stories in a way that's counterproductive sometimes, because it does not help the situation to enrage people, but maybe it might sell newspapers, maybe it might get clicks, maybe it might increase your engagement on your social media site, but it's just not in line with what the data is saying. And that is what often perpetuates the perception reality gap, in the same way that when we say, actually, crime is down, but they'll say, but it doesn't feel like it's down. And so what are the factors that cause you to not feel like it's down? Another factor is having the devices in our hands that allow us to see more of the violence than we used to see. And so it feels experientially like this thing is on the rise, but it's not on the rise, actually. It's as low as it's ever been, as the data that you've presented shows. But people don't want to hear that in the moment when they want to be angry about the thing. And also, I think it points to ways in which we perceive, because if there's a gender division of labor in criminality and in violence, then now the invisibility is a function of how we see women's violence or women's work, or the passive ways in which women may pass on violence to men. And so a woman X will hate her sister and procure all of the men necessary to ensure that her sister is killed. You know, that kind of a thing. So I think that's also a part of the conversation.
So one of the ways which we were able to make them more visible was from the gang trials.
Yes.
And not only the trials, but also the charges. So this is something that we realized was, okay, this is actually where we can see where the women are. Through the prosecution of gangs, the anti-gang legislation, how does that show up as a prosecutor of the gangs? Is this something that is also like revealing for you as a prosecutor in this field of, we're now getting to actually see the women because we have these charges that we can lay that we might not have had before?
Well, interestingly, it is harder to prosecute the woman in these gang cases because it doesn't inure to the benefit of the gang, nor does it inure to the benefit of the individual, and I'll explain that. The gang needs a front. The gang needs somebody who is acceptable so that when they want to live in a particular community, they need that figure to rent this space. And the landlord will be more open to renting their home or their property to this attractive looking female, this non-gangster looking, non-violent looking female, which is why I say it doesn't inure to the benefit of the gang or the organization or the grouping to present as a gang. That's another role the female plays. It doesn't inure to the benefit of the female either, because she's diverse. She's not just a gangster. She's not just a mama. Let's look at her. She was wife. She was pastor. She was seeing about legal affairs. She has concerns for her own children as well. So for the female who is a violence producer, who is a gangster, it doesn't inure to her benefit either to present as a gangster, to present as a don, to present as a leader of a criminal organization. So to answer your question more specifically and more pointedly, it is harder for us. I can speak specifically to a particular case where it was a female who rented the space and had gangster relatives living there, leaving there every morning to commit crimes elsewhere and then return in the evening. How then do you prove that what she did by simply renting a nice house in a nice community facilitated this gang? Who is going to come to speak to that? How do you prove that when she got up in the mornings and got dressed and went out to her civil servant job and returned in the evening, how do you prove that she knew that the other occupants of the home that she had rented, collecting money from a criminal enterprise, criminal activity, how do you prove that she knew how this money was coming in? So it does not inure to the benefit of the front, this female, nor does it inure to the benefit of the organization for her to present as a gangster. It makes it hard for us.
So is it for the legislation to catch up with that?
It is, I'm not going to say it's for the legislation to catch up. It is for us to recognize that she recognized and knew what she was doing.
Again, going back, if I might just piggyback on that
Please.
point, again, going back to this idea of recognizing and legitimizing in our analysis the roles that women do play as important roles in the modern criminal organization. And so for us, we look at the evolving structure of criminal organizations, the modernization of criminal organizations, the increasing sophistication, which includes high-level, very important roles for women to perform. And so they might not be the person collecting the extortion money, but they're collecting the money from the person who collects the money. They're liaising between the banker, which is a very important role in the modern criminal organization, the banker. They may be the banker, but they may not be the banker, but they liaise with the banker because various fees, like attorney's fees, have to be paid. Yeah? So she has to sanitize that process. And she must be legitimate in what she's doing. And there are so many people who, I'm thinking of a case right now where she was ostensibly a hairdresser, but just the volumes of money that moved through her hands was far beyond that which you could ever reasonably expect a hairdresser to earn. But then you go to her boss and look, I want nothing to do with this. Don't ask me any questions. I pay her this. Go and figure out the rest yourself. You know, because 2 weeks working in the hairdresser parlor could not do that. But some of these things is the baby mother or the gangster's mother. When you look at the modern criminal organization and the role of the woman in the modern criminal organization, they might not be committing more violent crimes, but they are definitely becoming more embedded. Directly, yes. So they might not directly do it, but they might give the order to do it. They might not be directly doing it, but their embeddedness in the organization qualitatively is manifest.
Okay, so we do have some questions from Slido, and so I'm kind of playing two roles here, both as the presenter and the researcher as well as the moderator. But I'll answer from my perspective, and then I'll ask the others to say what they, from their perspective. So one of the things that we said was that women generally enter gangs based on the research through their family connections and the communities that they grew up in. We weren't able to detect an idea of that there's coercion involved, certainly not in the types of engagement that we were able to identify. And so the question is, what is their typical point of entry? And it is through these community ties, these family ties, these intimate relationships, and so on, which I suppose is one of the differentiating things from male participation, that there is generally a notion that they may be coerced in a way that it seems that women are not coerced. That was what we found. I don't know if that would ring true for you at all in any of your research.
Right, yes. So at the IGDS, we have done studies on masculinity and crime. The IGDS is a regional institute, so we do this research, Trinidad, Barbados, Jamaica, and so on. And I think there are nuances to any of this, to this discussion of entry, because as your report also says, a part of the entry is not only community, but a sense of belonging. I think we have to really recognize that while crime and violence are so debilitating to lives and family and society, there are imperatives. There are lots of imperatives in being involved in community, in being involved with persons who are like-minded, who have had similar experiences, finding bonds, finding kinship ties in these spaces. So we speak about the romantic relationships, but we also have just this sense of a young girl going to school who may not feel loved and cared for in her family, who finds this elsewhere. And so there are very many points of entry, and then as you have said through the discussion, there are many points of advantages, either economic or otherwise. And so the entry points are, in some ways, sort of naturally flowing in that way. And then we have found evidence where the coercion is real. We do have, and I was going to say that, Dennis, when you're speaking, when you made your opening remarks, that can't we tell both stories? Because of course we can't ignore the fact that women are quite vulnerable in our society in terms of human trafficking, in terms of sexual and other types of abuses. So I don't really want to divorce the two. They are quite interconnected. And of course, when we look at the ways in which women mother and the types of issues that happen around that, and violence to children and how it continues, that entry point into violence. So again, it speaks to this issue of a very nuanced, very complex, complicated, intersectional nature of entry points into crime. I don't know that, I don't have data which will say that men are more likely to be coerced. I think there's a greater expectation of men in certain communities to be part of unenforced and shutters and so on. But I think we can't ignore that there are imperatives there as well for women.
I think, yes,
I'm
please.
sorry. From the files that I've seen, it's a more gentle introduction. It's a family business. It's what's done in the community. What is interesting, though, is after you become a member, leaving, maintaining the status quo, violence can be brought to you. So you're eased in. The example given, you're a young lady in the community, and somebody shows you love, somebody supports you financially, and so you gently get in. You're there before you even know. You're being asked to do things before you build up resistance. But to leave, to exit, it's a totally different thing. And so you get in gently, but you have to stay.
I don't tend to focus on the poor, innocent person who just happened upon the violent lifestyle. In many instances, and I don't want us to ignore the reality of political ambition. There is a great deal of power that one derives from being in these positions. That, yes, it might be that someone is exerting their power on you, but very quickly, you as the young girl feel a sense of power from being the baby mother of the Don. Or there are mothers, and I'm talking about very recent cases that people have been talking about and don't know, but there are mothers who feel a sense of power because them daughter there with bad man. And so there's an intergenerational power almost because, oh no, you're almost like a royal family in this community. And also people need to appreciate that, like for instance, in the case of Stephanie Christie, that she was a very powerful woman in the organization, as you described, and she wielded that power. And yes, there was the element of feminine wiles that was, and feminine guile that was manifest, but she was not an innocent victim in wielding that power. She knew exactly what she was doing. And power can be addictive for many people. And also the economic gain, though ill-gotten gain, the economic gain also affords one a lifestyle. And so you're there with the chopper and the scammer and whoever, and them a bang the line, and you derive a lot of things. And there is a materialist motivation that people have, and they find themselves caught up in the lifestyle, and before they know it, they're deeply entrenched in it. And if you want to benefit here, then there are things that you have to do as being part of the family, as being part of the family business. And I mean, you don't know, maybe it might have started out innocently and you didn't realize how deep you were in, but oh yes, you're in deep.
Okay, so we're going to actually take questions from the audience, people who haven't put their question to Slido, and we have someone there. Could you stand and project your voice and give your question?
Thank you. Thank you. So congratulations, to CAPRI on the work that they have done. And as soon as I saw it, I needed to make space to be here today because it's a topic that I am very interested in. And I'm just going to jump into the question and ask if it is that we are missing the low-hanging fruits as it relates to prosecuting women who are indirectly involved in criminality. And I'm asking this as it relates to just what we said about women in general. We spoke about how women have been a big part of everything else in our society. And so I don't know if it is possible for them to be a big part of everything else except criminality. And so there is a saying that says that nations are built on the backs of men, but cradled in the womb and arms of women. And I'm asking if that's not the same thing as it relates to criminality, where our women, as you have been saying, are facilitators, instigators, sometimes creators of criminals. And as a consequence, should the policy push, therefore, be to target the women as low-hanging fruits, as a means to deterring crime? So, for instance, we found that there's a song that said, "Bad man in she like that." That's a song that talk about bad man. Let's talk about "In her arms." Let's use that for the sake of who we're speaking to here today. Yes? And that song was streamed more time in Jamaica when it came out than in Trinidad, where it came from. And that's because the view is that I want a bad man. And so should we be changing the policy to prosecute the woman who wants a bad man? So if it is that you're wanted and I was found in your home, then automatically you're locked up. And then your son starts thinking, I don't want my mother to be locked up, and I don't want my wife or my girlfriend to be locked up. Or if you rented that home that you spoke about, then automatically you're aiding and you're abetting. Is it time for us to move the policy to where we can actually see real change by actually grabbing at the low-hanging fruit, which it seems that our women are, because research also shows that women are easier deterred than men. And so if they are involved, even if not at the forefront, if we can use them as a way to change what is happening, why aren't we moving in that direction?
I was going to say, I'm going to hand that to the law enforcement people.
I like the question, and I'm not certain how Madam Deputy DPP is going to answer it, but what you often see as the gang trials, for instance, you hear 20 people, 30 people, and this is, unprecedented because now we're utilizing the anti-gang legislation. But very often, the people who fall off of the gang cases in the early stages, the facilitators, the whatever, are persons who we would have sought to charge for being a member of a criminal organization. If the Jamaican jurisprudence takes us in that direction, if the judgments and the rulings take us in that direction, we will ultimately prosecute them. But let's not think that we don't try, because they are parts of the cases, but along the way, it ends up what it ends up. And then I can...
So I won't talk to you about policy. What I will talk to you about is law. And so Dennis spoke about the anti-gang trials. But outside of the anti-gang trials, so when we are not able to prove that they're members of a gang or participating in a criminal organization, but we are able to put them before the court for other offenses. So they're in the gun court. They're being tried for possession, now it is called prohibited weapon or unauthorized weapon, or illegal possession of firearm. When they participate in gang rapes, they're charged for rape by way of common design. They're charged for aiding and abetting, or for wounding, or for murders. So while they may not be registered as gangsters because they're not being tried under that rubric, they are before the court. So they're not low-hanging fruit. They are being tried for other offenses. Additionally, they are agents because they assist us in the prosecutions. So even though they're not going in the witness box, they're not swearing on the Bible and giving evidence, they are providing intelligence. So for those persons who are intimately involved and for their own safety and security, they are not prosecuted, one, and they are not giving evidence, but the police will tell you they have provided intelligence. And some of them, not just for those persons who have already been prosecuted, but they continue to provide us with information. So they are assisting with law enforcement type activities, and they are assisting with prosecutions. So it's not low hanging. And while I can't speak to you about policy, I can say to you, and I'm seeing attorneys, both defense and prosecutors, in the audience, and I see them nodding because the women are being prosecuted. And we don't discriminate. I don't care if you're male or female. I pick up a file, I read it, and if the ingredients of the offense are made out, we prosecute you with the same level of energy, male or female.
For example, a totally hypothetical case of, for instance, maybe two persons who may have been wanted or a person of interest in a murder. There may have been, like, for instance, a confrontation, one fatal, and then one arrested, and then you may hear 3 women were taken into custody. And that's all that you hear, hypothetically.
Of course, I'm racking my brain. What stories is Dennis talking about there? Okay.
I would just
please.
just very quickly, just to say, Georgia, my fellow Wolmerian, I have to say that. Where I have the luxury of not having that legal imperative. And so definitely what I think, as the panel has said, it's not necessarily an issue of low-hanging fruit. But for me, it is more about how can we employ an empowerment framework with these women, right? So if in some cases, if they're helping in the issue of prosecution, that's very important, obviously. But we do also have the issue of stemming the tide of further recruitment and that entry point of young girls. So this is focusing on women, but they're young girls who are being groomed. We speak about grooming in various types of ways, but they are being groomed. And I think where I will agree with the low-hanging issue is that if we can employ structures and strategies and policies that are not so prosecution-focused only, or not merely prosecution-focused, but focus on reform and reintegration and stemming the tide from the youth coming in to do the same thing. I think that's the luxury I have, not being in the legal space. So I would add that.
I mean, so kind of to pick up off of that, which is one of the, I think, things that came out so much. The original question that we set out to answer was, we want to identify what women are doing, what their roles are, so we can try and have targeted policies to divert them. But one of the things that was confounding to us was that the structural issues are so strong that to actually get to the women is actually something that policy is very difficult to actually do, and that a more doable policy action is to try and treat the surrounding circumstances and environment, which was why we ended up with this, a driver, even though it's not really a driver, of the community itself, and the recommendation that the reform of the community, because the way that women are embedded in these networks, they're difficult to identify, but they're also, and as you say, it suits them to remain difficult to identify, but it's also very difficult to get them out because they're so deeply embedded. They're acting as informants and providing surveillance services, but they're also being surveilled. So getting to them as individuals is actually a very difficult thing as a policy action or a policy objective was one thing. So I suppose, to sort of answer or to try and give a thought to what the answer would be is I think just part of understanding women's roles more could probably raise awareness among the people who are doing the arresting in the first place, to bring them to you, for you to see the file, and then you can decide, is there a merit here to be. All right, I think we saw another question, yes.
Good night. Good night, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so my name is Corey Robinson, and I'm one of the journalists that Dennis mentioned earlier, and I'm from the Gleaner Company. Now, I have a couple of questions. My first question is, what was the data for this study collected, one, and what was the cost of the study?
What was the?
The cost. Was there a financial cost for the study?
Of the study?
Yeah.
Well, the European Union has funded the study. We, as part of a 4-year, 9-study project that I actually don't know what the overall grant amount is, because I try not to get myself involved in those aspects of the organization. But I can't tell you what the exact cost was in terms of this study cost exactly this amount. But I'm not sure why that's relevant.
How was the data collected, though, for the study?
Pardon?
How was the data collected for the study?
So the data, well, we collected data from the JCF, from the Department of Correctional Services, primarily to look at arrest data, incarceration data, data also from Statin and PIOJ through the Jamaica Survey of Living Conditions, which also has some of this data. And then, as we said, the hard data didn't tell us very much. It didn't give us a strong sense of this idea of the rising female gangstress, and so we looked to other sources. We looked to the gang prosecutions, the trials themselves, the arrest records and the arrest reports, the charges that had been laid, to get an idea of what women were being arrested for and charged for. Other academic work, other policy work that's been done, including in the Caribbean, but also in Central America, which have similar gang dynamics as we do. The media, popular media, social media.
You see, Diane, the thing is, I've been a journalist covering crime for almost 2 decades. And I am a student in national security and strategic study at UE, a graduate. Now, I've been standing here trying to understand, from my perspective, what is it new that I'm learning from this study?
Sorry, I'm not hearing.
No, I'm saying I've been trying to understand what is it that I'm learning new from this study, right? I've been told that there are less than 3% of women who are actively involved in being perpetrators of gang offenses, right? And I'm also told that females are critical facilitators of crime, particularly as it relates to money, whether it be spending money, money laundering, etc., which I think that is fundamentally the modus operandi of gangs in Jamaica, the main purpose. My question is, have we missed the mark in fully examining the roles, the facilitator roles that women play in Jamaica in the study?
Well, I think that was what the research found, is that they are playing very crucial roles, but it's trying to pull them to the surface in a way that we can clearly identify them. That was what was challenging, but we were able to do it in large part because of the gang trials, because of the arrest data, because of and not the numbers, the particulars of the arrests that gave us this information as to what they're doing. And, the recommendation is with this greater awareness, that law enforcement would be looking more for these things rather than assuming that they don't exist or not being aware that they exist. And I hope I'm answering your question.
Well, I'm just thinking, because like some of the facilitator roles that we understand in Jamaica, right? Harboring of a fugitive. We're talking providing false and misleading information to the police, right? We're talking about hiding weapons and ammunition. How difficult are these components to study? All right, well, does the police have information to speak to these facilitator roles? And how difficult is that to study?
Well, I think that was what we covered in the study, was exactly that information that we would have gotten from police reports. What we weren't able to study, which is what Delia mentioned at the very outset, and this would have been also a challenge based on what we had available to us in terms of funding support, was actually talking to the women themselves and getting an understanding. That's one thing that we were not able to do. That, as you would know as a journalist, getting access to populations is difficult for the researcher, and also you put them in a risky position as well. As you would know, also just getting information from witnesses who can't even be seen talking on a phone talking to someone. So that, I think, was the biggest challenge in terms of really getting to the nuances of women's involvement. I mean, what we were able to see is obviously a very surface level, what is reported by others, what's reported by journalists, what's reported by the police, what's reported in the trials. That is a very difficult and expensive task to try and get to that nuance. That would then allow us to get to the people more directly, to the perpetrators and the criminals, or the would-be criminals or would-be perpetrators themselves. Yeah, and that was it. That was data that we had. Yes, that's included either directly or by reference in the study. I think they're there. Give it another read. All right, we have another question here. Yes.
Yes. Good night. Leighton Condison. How strong is Jamaica Witness Protection Programs? Program is cooperatives still relocated outside of Jamaica, or what?
I'm not hearing you.
Oh, okay. Well, that's actually something that we discussed when we were talking about what we would include and what we wouldn't include in the report. He asked about the Witness Protection Program. And what we have learned about the Witness Protection Program, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the state does not like to talk about it because it's something that they want to keep as secret as possible. That it needs resources, but with the resources that it has, it actually functions very well, and that they've never lost a witness, is my understanding. And I think that they probably don't want to say anything, and so unless I've said something egregiously incorrect, I think that that's going to be the answer. But we did think about, well, should we recommend, more witness protection program services for women? But we don't know enough. We don't have that granular detail of what exactly it would take to safely get a woman into a program like that. We don't have that very, very granular data to do that.
It works. Okay. It works.
It works. That, as I said, my original thing was I'm being supported in that it does work, but it needs more resources. Yes.
It works.
Okay. Yes, Jenny. Oh, this is the final question, I'm being told.
Thanks. Yeah. I wanted, one of your speakers spoke about the power of the partners, the female partners of gang members. But some research that was, in fact, I was involved with CAPRI, also brought out their vulnerability, because once you are, the partner or a girlfriend of a gang member, you know a lot. And therefore, you can't walk away. You're always going to be tied to that person. Not necessarily as their only partner, but sometimes as their only partner. But you know so much that you are actually tied for life to that person. And you have to be very careful, or you will get killed. People, girlfriends have been murdered because they knew a lot and they were not trusted.
Yeah. But, I mean, I think that supports what you had said earlier about getting out is so difficult and so risky for many of the women who are involved in the various roles that they play. And I'm sure that that's something that you would have also come across as well, Dennis.
In looking at the numbers, we have seen, and as I said, there's more research to come out on this, but I mean, generally speaking, in looking at the numbers, women are often, the women who are victims of violent crime are often victims of violent crime because of their proximity to perpetrators of violent crime, whether it's your son, your brother, your uncle, etc. And sometimes you are there in the space, or you are perceived as someone who they care about, or wrong place at the wrong time, or you know too much, etc., etc. And so you may be caught up in a reprisal or a counter reprisal or that kind of thing, but women are often victims of violence because of their proximity to other persons who are perpetrators, and not because they are women in and of itself.
Well, it's almost that they're almost in the gang even if they're not in the gang because of this proximity. All right, well, thank you so much to our audience, including those who put questions on Slido. We will have an Instagram Live to answer the questions that we did not get to in the discussion. But our last task is just, if you could, in 1 minute, each of you, just say what you would want people to be thinking about this topic, both from the report, from this discussion, and from your own experiences and your own perspectives on this topic. If someone was to leave here to say, this is what is important to know about women in organized crime in Jamaica, what would you say? I'll start in the same way that we came around. Delia.
I think one thing I would want persons to know is that we don't have a crime fighting plan that does not include a gender analysis. If I'm going to be quick, I don't need a whole minute. Gender analysis is critical, and that's not only a look at women, it's a look at intersectionalities, it's a look at what are imperatives for men, and how men, relationships among men and relationships among women and between the two, how they really drive and lead to our understanding of the real meanings and issues behind crime and violence, and therefore how to emerge from the challenges that we have. So gender analysis is key.
Okay. I'd actually consider that a structural issue. Yes.
I would just say that women are competent, women are intelligent, they are capable, they are powerful, they are influential. That all of that must inform how we protect them from violence, but also how we prosecute them and bring them to justice.
Culture still plays an important role in our justice system, how we approach criminals and criminal activity. And so even though the report speaks to the trend going in the opposite direction in terms of the number of women being incarcerated and the rate, it is because of our cultural approach to women. So they're intelligent, they're logical, but we still see women as the fairer sex, the weaker sex, the sex to be protected. So when women are placed before the court, they're not placed before the court for the same types of offenses as our men. When they are convicted, they're not given the same types of sentencing as men. In fact, a man will be given a custodial sentence, and if there is an avenue for the woman to be given a non-custodial sentence, then she will get it. She'll be fined. She'll be given a suspended sentence. So culture still has a role, or culture is still playing that kind of role in our justice system, and how we look at women in terms of organized crime. Yeah.
Okay. I think my only takeaway would be to encourage everyone to read the report, download it from our website where it is, as well as the other shorter bits of it if you can't get through the whole report, would be my main takeaway. But I'd also just like to thank you so much for this very rich discussion and to thank all of our audience members for being here. And I'm going to ask Danae to come and send us home.
As we close today's launch of Hits and Misses, Women in Organized Violence, it's clear that the conversation around crime and gender needs to move beyond assumptions and surface-level narratives. This research has exposed the often overlooked roles that women play in organized criminal networks, roles that may not place them at the front lines of violence, but are critical for gang operations nonetheless. We're looking at financial management and intelligence gathering. Their involvement demands a sharper, evidence-driven approach to policy and law enforcement. So thank you to our panelists, Mrs. Claudette Thompson, Dr. Delia Bean, and Mr. Dennis Brooks, as well as our, own Diana Thorburn. Thank you so much. We appreciate your participation, and we can all agree that it was quite rich and thought-provoking. Thank you to our audience, both here at the AC Hotel and online. Know that we appreciate your engagement. Your questions and your participation are what makes these conversations meaningful. As for the questions we didn't get to answer on Slido, they are being noted and will be answered in an Instagram live session, CAPRI Chat, in the coming days. So I'm encouraging you all to come chat with us on our Instagram. So please follow our socials, Instagram, X, TikTok, and LinkedIn to find out when that will be. Also, if you happen to miss any part of the discussion or would like to revisit key moments, a replay of Hits and Misses, Women in Organized Violence will be available on CAPRI's YouTube channel. So we invite you to watch, share, and keep the conversation going. Because remember, our goal is not just to produce research, but to bridge gaps between evidence and action. CAPRI exists to provide clear, data-driven answers to the most pressing policy questions facing Jamaica and the Caribbean. So the full report, now launched, Hits and Misses, Women in Organized Violence, is now available for download at www.capricaribbean.org. Finally, none of this would be possible without the support of the European Union, whose trust in our work allows us to continue producing research that informs policy and drives change. We are also deeply grateful to our Gold Circle members, Jamaica's leading private sector companies, whose partnership ensures our sustainability and affords us the invaluable privilege of maintaining independence from sole reliance on foreign donors. And on that note, we're absolutely thrilled to officially welcome Proven, Guardsman, and the Richard and Diana Stewart Foundation to CAPRI's Gold Circle. Your commitment to supporting independent, evidence-driven research is invaluable, and we hope that others will definitely follow your lead. Before we go, I encourage you to look out for our upcoming launch of One City Study 1 and Study 2, which examines the governance and socioeconomic realities shaping Jamaica's urban centers. These reports, which I have personally worked on as a GIS specialist, go beyond describing the symptoms of urban dysfunction, but they lay out what needs to change and how. So, we hope you'll join us for that one when it comes. Until then, thank you for being a part of this one, and please join us for refreshments around the back.